Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I am Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about functions part 1 in JavaScript. So let's talk about functions in JavaScript, and functions are very important. What is a function in programming? A function lets you group a series of statements together to perform a specific task. Functions are normally written to allow for the reuse of code in an application so that tasks that are repeated in an application can be written once. In other words, we can actually put together a group of statements into a function, knowing that we're going to have to redo that function or redo that little grouping of coding many times. It's much easier to put into a function than just call the function every time we need to perform those particular statements. Grouping together statements in programming is a good way to organize your code, and functions assist in that development process. Functions are only executed when they're called, and we'll talk about that as we go through the demonstrations. When you ask a function to perform its task, that's known in programming as calling the function. The code inside a function is normally referred to as a code block, and code blocks can be a few statements long or thousands of statements long. It all depends on the task the function is performing. And I've actually written functions that were 1 or 2 statements, and I've written functions that have been 700 or 800 statements. Again, it just depends on what you're trying to get the function to perform, what type of task. Some functions require parameters to perform their tasks, and that's where we actually pass data into the function as we're calling it or invoking it, and then it'll use those parameters to perform its task. When a function is called and an answer is expected from the function, that answer is known as a return value from the function. And you'll see all those as we go through the demonstrations. You can also have what's called anonymous functions. They do not require a name and normally are called or executed as soon as the interpreter comes across them in the code. And occasionally you'll see those types of functions in an application that needs to perform a bunch of tasks as it's loading or right after it loads. You'll actually see the task or the application load, and then upon the completion of the load it will run through a couple of group functions to perform tasks to set itself up for the proper operation of the application. To create a function, you give it a name, then write the statements inside the curly braces needed to achieve the task the function is being developed for. This is known as a function declaration. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we've talked about with functions inside JavaScript. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation and get into our development environment. I want to go ahead and confirm that we have our Apache server up and running, which we do. I'm going to load Sublime Text 3, which will be my text editor for this demonstration, and Google Chrome will be the browser I'll be using. I'm actually in my local host inside section 2 of my exercise file directory. We're just now beginning section 2, and the first part of section 2 will be functions inside JavaScript. So we've actually completed section 1, which was the basics of JavaScript. Now we're actually going to get into some of the meat of the programming language. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got my template.html file up inside my editor. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as and save this as functions_1.html. So I want functions_1.html. I'm going to save that file. And that's going to be a file we're going to work with as we work through the demonstrations in this exercise. So the first thing I want to do is I want to just put in some basic information into the base file of my template. So I'm going to come up here under my container. I'm going to go ahead and put in an H3 heading. I'm also going to put in a div that has an ID of message. And inside the div I'm going to have a paragraph which is welcome to the site. And this is just a generic page that we're going to work with for this particular demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go back and let's load up function_1.html. And you'll see now we've got our heading and we've got the welcome to my site text. This is a great time to pause if you want to type this in. Because what I want to do now is I actually want to create a separate file which is going to actually hold the JavaScript function for me. So I'm going to go in my file menu, say new file. I want to do a save as. I'm going to save this inside my JS folder under message.js. So inside that message.js, I'm going to go ahead and first I'm going to create a variable. So I'm going to come right down on line 1 and I'm going to create this variable. Let's go ahead and turn on our word wrap. I'm going to create a variable called message, and that's going to equal this text. Remember to register on the website. All registered users receive 20% off on all tutorial purchases and notification of all new tutorials as they are released. So that's the variable that I just created inside my JavaScript file. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a function inside that file. And I'm going to come right down below my variable, and I'm going to paste in this function. And my function is called update message. And inside my update message function, I'm going to create a variable called element, and it is going to be equal to document.getElementById message. And this message is referring to the ID that we set right here inside our div. So I'm actually telling my JavaScript file to get that element by the ID name message, and I want you to take element.textContent equal message. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the element itself. I've created a variable that contains that element, and I'm telling it, okay, now element, I want to change your text content to this message. So I'm changing the content of that element to my message variable. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right underneath it, and I'm actually going to call that function, because obviously I can't invoke the function unless I call it. So inside my JavaScript file, and by the way, this is just one way that we would call this. There's actually other ways to do it, and I'll show you that as we work through some more exercises. But I'm actually going to call it inside the message.js file itself. I'm just going to save all those changes. This is a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type in this JavaScript file. And again, you'll notice I did create a JavaScript directory. Anyone that's been doing my tutorials for a while understands why I name my directories with the underscore first. And if you haven't done my tutorials before, the reason I do that in my directory or my file structures is that puts those folders at the very beginning of my list inside the root directory of my websites. It makes them much easier to find. So instead of becoming alphabetical and I have to search through sometimes hundreds or thousands of files to find the folders, by putting the underscore, it puts them all at the top of the listing, and then they're alphabetical by folder. Just a trick I learned a long time ago. Because when you're dealing with the root of a website, sometimes there can be thousands of files in the root structure of a website. Anyway, hopefully you'll have that typed in. Let's go back to our function underscore one.html. Let's go ahead and save all the changes we have. Update our website. We'll notice we've got no changes in that browser window. And the reason being is we actually haven't called that script file. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and call the script. I'm going to come right down just before the ending body tag inside my document. I'm going to paste in script source equal underscore JS / message.js. And what I'm doing is I'm actually calling that JS file that we just created right there inside my JS directory. I'm calling it. When we call that file, it's going to change the text inside our paragraph tag, because we're actually going into that ID element of the ID and we're changing the text content of that ID. So let's go ahead and save all those changes, refresh our browser window, and now we've got that nice big text statement that we put inside of our JS file to replace welcome to the site that was originally there. And it's all from calling that function inside our message.js file that we created. And again, we're going to go through many demonstrations of this. This is a very simple function. I just wanted to give you an idea how functions work. We have a keyword function that actually declares the function. I have the function name, which is update message, open and close parentheses. And by the way, in future functions, you'll see where we actually put parameters in those parentheses. Then I actually have the statements that are in the function. Here's my first statement where I create the variable element. And then my second statement where I actually populate the text content of the variable element based on the variable message that we created at the top of the message.js file. So this particular function has two statements to it. Each one ends in a semicolon, as we discussed in previous tutorials. It has the function keyword, the name of the function, then the function bodies in between the two curly braces where we actually control our function statements. All right, so let's look at another function example inside of JavaScript. So the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and do save as. I want to go ahead and save this as function underscore 2.html. And again, so we don't overwrite that initial file, I'm going to go in and remove the code. So I'm going to remove my script element. Let's go ahead and remove all my stuff other than the container. Save that file, and let's go in and update so we can actually bring that file in a browser window. And the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and put in an H3 with sample functions. So I'm going to take that out of my text file and go ahead and paste that in place. Let's go ahead and save that, update the browser, and we've got our heading in there so we know we're good. Next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and put in a paragraph with some text in it. So again, I'm just going to come right below that H3 heading, and I'm just going to assign or put a paragraph in here, give it an ID of test1, and I'm just going to put in, this is some sample text in our document that JavaScript will restyle. So what I'm going to have to do, I'm actually going to write a function that's going to restyle this text for us using JavaScript. So again, I've given the paragraph an ID of test1, then just put in some text. It's a good time to pause if you want to type that in. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a button to this so we can actually have something that's going to trigger the JavaScript. Because don't forget, we're going to have to invoke that function in order to get it to run. So I'm going to create a button right underneath my paragraph. I'm going to give it a type of button. And I'm in the onClick event, I'm going to call this JavaScript function I'm getting ready to create, my second function, or my second FUNC. And it's just say, click me. And basically what that's going to do is it's actually going to call the procedures or statements that are in that second function to restyle that paragraph text. So then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write the script. And again, keep in mind that this would normally be an external file. And actually, I'm going to show you how to do this both ways. I'm actually going to put this in our document. Then I'm going to go add it to my message.js file and show you how we can call this from a remote file. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's demonstrate how we've got it set up here first. I'm going to go to right below my body tag, and I'm going to actually put this script inside my document. So it resides in the document itself. And what I've got is I've got a function called mySecondFunc, F-U-N-C. It creates a variable x, and that's going to be equal to document.getElementById test1. So I'm actually getting this paragraph text. Then it's telling it, okay, at x, now that we know what's there, because we've actually loaded it into the variable x, I want you to set the style font size to 32 pixels, and then I want you to change the style color of that font to blue. So I'm actually modifying two styles inside this paragraph once I get the paragraph by filling up variable x. And this x, by the way, this could be named anything. Anything you want to name, I just used x because it's fast and it's simple. I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. Go ahead and type that in if you want. Good time to pause. Now I'm going to go refresh my browser window, and you'll notice I've got that paragraph and I've got this nice little click me button. And if I click the button, it restyles my text based on the settings and styles that I've got in my function called mySecondFunc. And anything that I put in here, by the way, I could change the styling to, whether it's font size, font weight, font color, whether I wanted italic, the type of, if I wanted display inline block, any CSS, valid CSS style, I can put inside this function. And again, just like before, I get the keyword function. I've given my function a name. mySecondFunc is the name with its parentheses. I don't have any parameters in this particular function. And then I set up three statements. My first statement sets the variable x. My second statement sets up the font size. And my third statement sets up the font color. So all I need to do to implement those is to call the function by clicking the button. So if I click the button, I call the function. Let me show you another way that we could do this. All right, another way we could do this, and actually the way that we would do this most often, is we'd actually have these functions residing in an external file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this function, and I'm going to do Control X on the PC, Command X on the Mac to cut it out of my document. I'm going to go into my message.js file that we created in the previous exercise, and I'm going to paste that function into that file. So now I've got two functions in there, and I've actually got one function that's being called by the file itself. But I'm going to actually make some modifications to this file. Right now I'm just actually cleaning up the formatting because, again, best practice, I always try to follow best practices when I set up my code. I'm going to save this file as, and I'm going to keep it inside this directory, by the way. It's going to be inside my JS directory. I'm just going to call it helper.js. So I'm going to save the file as helper.js. I'm going to remove this update message because I don't want this function called there. And I'm going to leave everything else just like it is. So I've got two functions, and I've got this variable that I created at the top. And this is going to be called my helper.js file. And I'm going to go back into my function _2.html. And I'm going to remove those script tags. And if you remember from the first tutorial, we actually called we actually called an external file message.js. What I'm going to do is right before I close my body tag on this file, I'm actually going to go in and put that back, but this time I'm going to call my helper.js. So I'm actually calling the helper.js file in this file from the external file. I'm going to save all those changes. I'm going to refresh the browser window. Everything goes back to normal. But now you'll notice that I don't have the script inside my function_2 file. Or do I? Since I actually called this external file, I can still invoke that function. Because what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, go to this helper.js file. If you find that mySecondFunc, run it. So if I go back here, refresh the browser window, click that button, I still get the same result. The nice thing with doing this in an external file is now I can call that function from anywhere inside my website, because as long as I have the link in here linking it to the page, I have anything that's in here available. I could actually create another function. Let's go back into my document for a minute. Let's take this paragraph. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to come down here and just put in a couple lines and paste it. I'm going to change the ID of that paragraph, because if you remember here, we've got message is the ID we're looking for there. Let's change this to message. And now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a second button, because again, we're going to need a way to call that function. And on this one, I don't want to call mySecondFunc. I actually want to call updateMessage on that particular function. So I'm going to say update message. And over here, I'm just going to say update message. And this one is going to be style me. Now I actually have put a responsible name to each one of these buttons, so I know what the buttons are doing. If I save all those changes, great time to pause if you want to type all this stuff in. I go back and refresh my browser window. Now I have two groups of text, but if I say update message, I get my message response. If I say style me, I get my style response. So I'm calling two different functions with this particular function names, but they're called from a helper.js file. And the beauty of this is I could use these functions. Now say these were functions that actually checked at data input. They were confirming the proper data structure, or they were encrypting a password or whatever. I could use these anywhere on my site now, because now I've got them in an external file. All I have to do is call them from within that web document. And that's one of the beauties of keeping this stuff in external files. And you'll see many more demonstrations of this as we go through the training. But I wanted to introduce it early because it is a best practice. It is the way the professional web developers actually link most of their stuff together. And I wanted you to see, just in a really fast demonstration, how that all works. All right. All right, so real quick, let's look at these functions that we created and go through one more time as to how we've done this. So first you'll notice that each function has the function keyword. That's what sets it up as a function. I've also given each function a name, and that name includes parentheses. So the first function is update message. The second function is mySecondFunc, F-U-N-C, or function. So each function has a name. Then I have my opening and closing curly braces for each function. And I've got the statements that make up the task I want the function to perform inside those curly braces. Every statement ends with a semicolon, and when I'm ending the function, I end it with a curly brace. So we've done that for both of our functions. The only difference between the first and the second function is I actually have an external variable that I'm calling into the second function, and we do that quite often, as you'll see as we go through the exercises. But again, I just want you to get an idea of how functions are structured as we go forward, because in part 2 of the tutorial series, we're actually going to start adding some parameters to these functions so we can pass in data and get returns back. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was a good introduction to functions in JavaScript, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2 of the functions in JavaScript.